Hey there, thanks for jumping on and joining me for the part one overview of To Kill a Mockingbird. Now, part one is made up of chapters 1 through 11 in our story. And instead of going plot point by plot point or chapter by chapter, what I've done is I've broken up the part one of our story into 5 different topics. So the topics I'm going to be covering today are 1, the children's obsession with Boo Radley, 2, the Maycomb citizens and what to make of them. 3, growing up and the life lessons we see in our story so far. 4, Atticus and this looming trial. And 5, this idea of the Mockingbird. Let's go ahead and get started with our topic 1. So the children's obsession with Boo Radley makes up a huge part of part 1 of our story. So we see that the children base most of what they know about Boo Radley on neighborhood legend. And the story of Boo Radley goes that when he was a teenager, he got into some trouble, stole a cop car, took a little joyride around town, locked the police officer in the outhouse, and then him and his friends get into some trouble. The friends get sent to this boarding school and end up living okay lives afterwards. And Boo Radley is forced to remain in his house by his father for over 15 years. And we don't know exactly how he keeps Boo Radley there. Jem thinks that his father must chain him up to the bed, whereas Atticus tells us that there are other ways of making people into ghosts, which makes us think that Atticus believes that Mr. Radley is using some sort of psychological torture or some other methods of keeping Boo Radley inside the home. Now, in our story, we have Scout, the narrator, her older brother, Jem, and then they have a friend that comes and visits every summer and stays the entire summer with his aunt. His name is Dill. And Dill is the one that kind of eggs this on. And the summer that Dill comes, they get so obsessed with Boo Radley that they want to make him come out. They write him a letter. They even try to peep inside his window at night and try to get a good look of him. None of this seems to work, and this just seems to pique their curiosity even more, to the point where the kids decide to come up with this game in which they reenact Boo Radley's life story out in their front yard. And I'm going to take a second and read a quick passage that talks about this story that they're reenacting. So this is on page 52 in your book. It was a melancholy little drama woven from bits and scraps of gossip and neighborhood legend. Mrs. Radley had been beautiful until she married Mr. Radley and lost all her money. She also lost most of her teeth, her hair, and her right forefinger. Dill's contribution. Boo bit it off one night when he couldn't find any cats and squirrels to eat. She sat in the living room and cried most of the time while Boo slowly whittled away all the furniture in the house. So these kids would make up, they would add to neighborhood legend, and they would make up these stories about this guy that lives down the street. Now, we're going to talk a little bit more about Boo Radley as we continue to discuss part 1, but we're going to start to see the kids' minds, at least some of the kids' minds, change about Boo Radley as the story goes on. This brings us to topic 2 in our story, which is the Maycomb citizens and what we are to think of them. We can learn a lot about these citizens just based on how they view the Radleys and how they treat Arthur Radley or Boo Radley and the Radley family. So I'm going to take a quick second and read on page 10 of our book. It says, once the town was terrorized by a series of morbid nocturnal events. People's chickens and household pets were found mutilated. Although the culprit was Crazy Addie, who eventually drowned himself in Barker's Eddy, people still looked at the Radley place unwilling to discard their initial suspicions. So this passage reveals that the Maycomb citizens have this prejudice against the Radley family, and even when that prejudice and even when their initial suspicions are proved false, they still stick to their original beliefs, so they don't change their mind easily. And once they decide that somebody is an outsider or somebody doesn't belong, they seem to stick with that. We also see this with the Yule family. So yeah, the Yules aren't great. We see that Burris Yule is described as being filthy, and that his family doesn't come to school all but once a year, and the father is just allowed to hunt out a season. But instead of stepping in and having the citizens try to help the Yule family or try to change the Yule family, they just allow them to continue to live the way they live. But this is coming at the expense of the children, who are clearly not being taken care of in the Yule household. We also see that the Maycomb citizens are quick to judge in the Tom Robinson trial. So we don't even, as readers, know much about the trial yet. The citizens of Maycomb don't know much about the case yet they assume that Tom Robinson is guilty because he is a black man in their community. And he's being accused of raping a white woman in their community. So they're very closed-minded and they are unwilling to change their mind once their mind has already been made up. Now, it is important to note, however, that on the outside, this appears to be a nice, warm, welcoming community that looks out for each other. And in some ways, that's true. We see that the Maycomb citizens help Miss Maudie put out the house fire, and they work together to protect their neighborhood. However, pay close attention to who these people are helping and why they're helping them. So even though they appear to be nice, kind people, they're nice and kind to the people that are like them. And to the people that they consider outsiders, they can be pretty nasty and awful towards them. This brings us to topic 3, which is growing up in life lessons. So we were just talking about how the Maycomb citizens aren't as great as they may first appear, and Jem is starting to realize that. So he, just like Scout, at the beginning of our story is pretty naive to what's going on around him. However, he starts to realize things that Scout does not. For example, when Nathan Radley, Boo Radley's brother, fills the knothole with cement to prevent his brother, Arthur Radley, from leaving gifts in the knothole, Jem realizes that it was Boo leaving the gifts, and he therefore sees how cruel it is that Nathan Radley is cutting off Boo Radley's only way of connecting to the outside world through these gifts that he's giving the children. So Jem is going from, one, seeing Boo Radley as a monster at the beginning of the story, to here in this scene actually feeling empathy for Boo. However, he's also seeing how cruel Nathan Radley is, and he also sees Nathan Radley directly lies to his face. So he is starting to feel what it feels like to be lied to, whereas before he probably trusted adults and believed adults. So kind of think about in your life experience when maybe you realize that not all adults tell the truth and that people can be cruel and mean. And this impacts Jem, right? He takes it hard. He cries because he's upset because he's starting to, lose some of his childhood innocence. We also see that at the end of the chapter where Miss Maudie's house is burning, that Jem is even trying to protect Boo Radley. He knows that Boo is the one that came and put the blanket on Scout, and he knows that if they bring the blanket back to the Radley house, Nathan will know that Boo Radley left, and he doesn't want that to happen. So he's willing to tell Atticus all these secrets to say, no, we can't bring the blanket back. And he's doing so at his own expense. So we see him go from seeing this man as monstrous to then even wanting to protect him. So we can see a lot about Jem and his evolution if we just take a look at how he thinks about Boo Radley throughout our story. Now, while it's important to note that the kids discover a number of life lessons on their own, Atticus is the one that really tries to drive home some important lessons. We're going to turn to page 39 and take a look at one of those lessons right now. This is the scene where Scout is talking about her day. It's her first day of school. Her and the teacher have a misunderstanding. She also criticizes Walter for pouring syrup all over his food. And Atticus tries to teach her that it's important to have empathy, to consider what other people's point of view are, and to consider what their life experience is. So this is on page 39. First of all, he said, if you can learn a simple trick, Scout, you'll get along a lot better with all kinds of folks. You never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view. Sir? Until you climb into his skin and walk around in it. Atticus said I had learned many things today, and Miss Caroline had learned several things herself. She had learned not to hand something to a Cunningham for one thing. But if Walter and I had put ourselves in her shoes, we'd have seen it was an honest mistake on her part. So throughout our story, this idea of empathy and not knowing what a person's life experience is a really critical theme and idea we'll see repeated throughout. Another life lesson from Atticus comes on page 149 after Mrs. DeBose dies, and Atticus is trying to show his kids, specifically Jem here, what real courage looks like. Page 149. A lady? Jem raised his head. His face was scarlet. After all those things she said about you, a lady? She was. She had her own views about things, a lot different from mine, maybe. Son, I told you that if you hadn't lost your head, I'd have made you go read to her. I wanted you to see something about her. I wanted you to see what real courage is instead of getting the idea that courage is a man with a gun in his hand. It's when you know you're licked before you begin, but you begin anyway, and you see it through no matter what. You rarely win, but sometimes you do. Mrs. DeBose won, all 98 pounds of her. So we know that Mrs. DeBose was a morphine addict, and she becomes addicted to morphine because the doctor prescribed it to her to ease the pain. And Atticus says, like, hey, it would be okay. She's an old lady. It's okay for her to be taking something like morphine to ease the pain. But it wasn't okay for Mrs. DeBose. She wanted to die beholden to nothing and nobody, and that was something that was important to her. And Atticus is trying to show the kids here that fighting for what you believe in and fighting for something that's important to you is an act of courage. Not shooting a dog in the middle of the street, but rather doing something that everyone thinks you are incapable of, but something that is important to you. That is an act of real courage. And we can easily connect this to what he's about to take on with the Tom Robinson trial that nobody wants him to take on in the first place. This brings us to topic 4, which is Atticus and the looming trial. Now, we haven't met Tom Robinson, which is the man that Atticus is defending, but we have heard a lot of people talk about the trial around town. And most people have a very negative opinion of Atticus and his willingness to not only take on the case, but also to do his best to defend Tom Robinson. Again, we know that this community is very racist, very prejudiced. They think that Atticus should, yes, take the case because that's his job, but basically that he should blow the case. And he tries to show his kids that in order for him to be able to live with himself and to hold his head high, he can't just blow the case, even if it would make their lives easier. Because we see people are not just being cruel to Atticus, they're going and saying nasty things to his kids as well. Like Cecil Jacobs at the schoolyard harasses Scout, uses the N-word in reference to Tom Robinson, and is saying all these nasty things. And we can see that Atticus taking on this trial is not only impacting him, but also his children. But here's what Atticus has to say about why he's taking on this case. Page 101. Scout, simply by the nature of the work, every lawyer gets at least one case in his lifetime that affects him personally. This one's mine, I guess. You might hear some ugly talk about it at school, but do one thing for me, if you will. You just hold your head high and keep those fists down, no matter what anybody says to you. Don't let them get your goat. Try fighting with your head for a change. It's a good one, even if it does resist learning. Atticus, are we gonna win it? No, honey. Then why? Simply because we're licked 100 years before we started is no reason for us to not try to win, Atticus said. So here again, we see this idea of courage and how Atticus views things differently than the rest of the town. He believes that he needs to do what's right and what's fair here, even if it means going against his friends and other people in the town that he would otherwise respect and normally agree with. All right, we are on our last topic, which is the Mockingbird. Let's go ahead and take a look at page 119, where we get a description of the Mockingbird from Atticus and Miss Maudie. When he gave us our rifles, Atticus wouldn't teach us to shoot. Uncle Jack instructed us in the rudiments thereof. He said Atticus wasn't interested in guns. Atticus said to Jem one day, I'd rather you shoot at tin cans in the backyard, but I know you'll go after birds. Shoot all the blue jays you want if you can hit 'em, but remember, it's a sin to kill a mockingbird. That was the only time I ever heard Atticus say it was a sin to do something, and I asked Miss Maudie about it. Your father's right, she said. Mockingbirds don't do one thing but make music for us to enjoy. They don't eat up people's gardens, don't nest in corn cribs. They don't do one thing but sing their hearts out for us. That's why it's a sin to kill a mockingbird. All right, so we've already discussed how the mockingbird represents innocence, specifically people who are innocent in our story. And oftentimes we see that these people who are innocent get persecuted or harmed in some sort of way. And we get this statement from Atticus saying it's a sin to kill a mockingbird. So it is sinful to hurt somebody or harm somebody who is innocent. So as you continue to read, make sure you're on the lookout for potential mockingbirds. The ones we talked about so far are characters like Boo Radley, who is doing things in the neighborhood, such as leaving the kids these gifts. He also mends Jem's pants and puts his blanket on Scout. However, people see him as this monstrous character who's chained to the bed and who eats raw squirrels, right? So we see that even though he's this innocent, maybe even very childlike character, he gets persecuted or talked about because he's different, because he's kept in the house all the time, because people don't understand him or what his life is like. We also can see people like the children as mockingbirds. So we see that they're very innocent because they're children. However, their world is getting shook up a little bit by this trial and what they're learning about the people in their town, and how not everybody is good-willed, and how not everybody can be trusted. And so they're starting to lose some of that innocence, which could be seen as killing or harming a mockingbird. So as we continue to read, make sure you're trying to spot out who might be the mockingbirds in our story, because this idea is really critical, and the author even names the story To Kill a Mockingbird. So that's part 1. Now, in part 2, we're going to see a definite shift from all of these childhood anecdotes and these stories about the kids growing up and about Boo Radley. And we're then going to see a shift more to the upcoming trial, and then eventually the trial of Tom Robinson. And that is going to be primarily the focus of chapter 2. So it's going to be the lead up to the trial, and then what happens as a result of the trial. Thanks for tuning in. Make sure you are talking to your teacher if you have any questions.